grasslands. In southern Saskatchewan, we are blessed to have one of the most ecologically sensitive areas in the entire world, and that is Grasslands National Park. If you're wondering how it all relates to a government bill and federal regulations, I can assure you that it does. In Part 3, Section 85 of Bill S6, it deals specifically with the issue of species at risk. And that is where the bill makes reference to an organization named COSWIC, which the government has identified as one of the organizations to be, or the only organization to be used for determining whether or not a species belongs on a list or not, and to determine what level of concern there should be. This is the type of issue facing Grasslands National Park. And for the moment, I'll try my best to fill everyone in on the background story that is involved in this. To say that the relationship with local stakeholders and producers has been rocky at best would be an understatement. During the park's early days, in classic big government fashion, the government booted the local ranchers out of the park and refused to let them graze the grasslands, stating that they were doing so to protect species at risk, but to also protect the native prairie grass. But over time, the number of species in the park dwindled and declined, the quality of the grass deteriorated, and researchers began to notice that all the species at risk had relocated themselves out of the park to the other side of the fence and into the private ranchers' pastures. Why would that happen? Well, because without a true keystone species to graze the grass, many of these smaller species became easy targets for their predators to eat. Of course, it used to be the case that buffalo were the keystone species for that area. But when that changed, it was possible in their absence for cattle to replace them as the main grazers and managers of the land in the park. That is what happened until the government, however, decided to put a stop to it. Once all the bureaucratic interference was removed and ranchers were allowed to graze in the park once again, the grasslands began to flourish and the vibrant species all returned to the park along with the cattle. It showed that there is a very delicate balance to be maintained between nature and human activity. They can work together and they can benefit each other. There's a good balance in the grasslands until some people from the government decided they knew better and needed to fix something that wasn't broke. Sounds very familiar to many issues that we face today. Now, let's fast forward to present day and see what's happening in the park. As I mentioned earlier, the government has appointed a group named COSWIC, which stands for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, through the Species at Risk Act, as the official designator of species at risk by making recommendations to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. But at the time, there seems to be no accountability mechanisms for the actions of COSWIC, and S6 is not changing that. Add to this the adversarial role that the government has taken towards the local stewards of the land and has become a growing disaster once again in Grasslands National Park. The difference is that ranchers have a built-in incentive for taking the absolute best care of not only the grasslands, but also the species that exist within and around the fences of their pastures. COSWIC has identified the black-tailed prairie dog as a threatened species. They're not yet listed as a Schedule 3 species at risk, but the fact that they are even on such a list makes one to wonder why that is. The black-tailed prairie dog is a species that thrives not only in Saskatchewan, but all the way down through the states to the Mexican border and probably even further into Mexico itself. And a quick Google search would actually verify that all the way through has a very vibrant population of this prairie dog. Despite the readily available information, does COSWIC take that into consideration? Does the minister even bother to check into it himself? And again, we have the issue of human interference with nature by COSWIC and other scientists. For example, anyone who's ever lived in Saskatchewan knows that when there's a drought or drier conditions, that gophers and these prairie dogs, they thrive and they can rapidly overtake an area. I've seen entire quarter sections of crop and hay land completely disappear within 2 years or even less, Madam Speaker. Yet, this is what COSWIC's website states. I'll quote, "The black-tailed prairie dog is a burrowing and colony-forming member of the squirrel family and is confined to only 12 square kilometers of grassland habitat in southern Saskatchewan. Initially assessed as a special concern by COSWIC in 2000, increasing threats posed by droughts and a bacterial disease could rapidly eradicate this species," end quote. And Madam Speaker, this is where local knowledge is vitally important, yet COSWIC refuses to utilize it. The prairie dog is not confined to 13 kilometers. Ask any rancher around the park. The species has spread and are continuing to spread into regions that researchers apparently have missed. But those involved on the agricultural side are more aware of what's going on. And this is something you have to get right if you want to properly manage the local wildlife. If you remember what I said earlier about the effects of grazing on species in the park, I'll now bring up another more recent example. The prairie dog and the sage grouse are intertwined with each other. The prairie dog eats the roots of sagebrush as they're tunneling in the ground, but the sage grouse needs the same plant for shelter and to protect itself from other species who would be looking to eat it. If the prairie dogs overtake the park, it's going to eliminate their shelter and chase the sage grouse out of the park. So the problem can turn out to be different depending on whether there are too few prairie dogs or if we are at risk of having too many. How does nature control populations of mammals in the animal kingdom, Madam Speaker? Well, there's two main ways. There's others, but these two are the most important, and that would be predators, and it would also be diseases. Yet, Coswick is going around and interfering in nature's natural course. Everything from the dusting of fleas to hand-feeding prairie dogs, which is causing them to not gather food and get themselves ready for winter as they become reliant on humans to feed them. With all of this, it seems like history might be repeating itself with Grasslands National Park. If we do not act with accurate information, if we do not try to maintain the right balance, this organization will mess and continue to ruin a delicate ecosystem. The most frustrating part is that we have seen this kind of thing happen before. Now, I've heard many people share their concerns on it for a very long time. The government's own website admits that local stakeholders have a difference of opinion, but the department and its activists don't care. The people of southern Saskatchewan demand accountability, and they demand respect from this government. These are multi-generational ranchers that have seen the sustainable development of grasslands for over a century, and this rogue organization with no government oversight is causing problems. There is no need to get in the way of our ranchers' way of life, especially when doing so will put more species at risk onto the list.